What's up, everybody? CHM Carnivorous here. I hope you're having a wonderful day and a wonderful week. Now, I thought I'd do something a little different. This is probably going to have to be a series, but I thought I'd go and make a video answering some of the most common questions that beginners have about growing carnivorous plants. And while I can't touch on all of them in this video, I will hope to get to them all in this video and future videos. So a lot to cover. So without further ado, let's get started. Question number one is, are carnivorous plants hard to grow? And I could not be more emphatic when I tell you that they are not. So one of the questions, or one of the answers rather, that I saw to this question was a really profound one, but very simple statement. Somebody asked, are they hard to grow? And somebody said they're not hard, they're just different. And that could not be more true. They are not any more difficult, in my opinion, than growing a regular plant. You just have to know what that plant needs. On that note, let's talk about, what do carnivorous plants need? So this is a big group of questions that gets asked a lot from new growers. What do they need? And let's talk about their media first and foremost. Now, if you're growing something like a Nepenthes, you'll want to give a media that is airy and inert. And so what I recommend is a 50-50 sphagnum and perlite mix. Now, this does a few things. First and foremost, it is inert, so it's not going to pull any nutrients through the roots. With Nepenthes, a lot of their roots are just there to hold the plant down. It might get some nutrients, but not much at all. And so it's important that you not only keep inert soil so it's not getting nutrients to those roots, but it's also important that you give them aeration, because these roots are very, very fine and they will rot very quickly, which will kill your plant. Sphagnum moss and perlite does a great job of allowing the inert environment that it needs, but also allows for airflow. Now, if you're talking about Drosera or sundews, or a Venus flytrap and cephalotus, you're going to want to use a peat and perlite mix. So peat is simply sphagnum moss that has been broken down over millennia and is more of a soil base or a dirt base. Now, the important thing here is it is inert as well. And the perlite or blasting sand or something, or a pool sand, as long as it's inert, are great because it will allow, again, for that airflow. It's not necessarily as important for Nepenthes as a Drosera that they get airflow to their roots, but it also helps to keep the soil from breaking down too much and becoming anaerobic. So for the questions of soil, it depends on the type of plant you're growing, but it's important that you understand that they do have different requirements. Now, you can grow Nepenthes in a peat perlite mix. Some of them actually prefer that. But for the most part, you're going to want a sphagnum moss perlite for Nepenthes and a peat perlite or pool sand for any of your bog type of plants, Sarracenia, Drosera, Venus flytraps, cephalotus to a small degree, and Utricularia. So the next important thing, it's clustered around this, how to grow these plants, and you see a lot of questions, and so this is going to be more of a compound question. Is light important? And when it comes to growing carnivorous plants, any plants in general, light is among, if not one of the most important things. But with carnivorous plants, it is equally as true, if not more, in a lot of cases, depending on what you're growing. Now, for Nepenthes, they like a good light cycle, about 12 hours, but they want 60% or dappled light. They do not want to be out in the very, very bright light. Now, there are some plants that can handle it better, like a Madagascariensis, but for the most part, they want that dappled light. If you're growing a Drosera or Venus flytrap, they like very bright light. 12 hours, if you can give that photo period to them, and they like very bright light. Now, if you are growing them and if you got them from a cellar, you want to slowly get them to that light. You don't want to stick them out there immediately, because you do run the risk of burning the plants. And we'll talk about that in just a few questions down the road. Now, what type of light? So you can either put them outside. If you live in a sunny area where it gets plenty of light, you can put them on a windowsill. Or if you're growing them in a tent like this, you can provide them LED lights that will allow them to sort of mimic those photo periods. And when it comes to light, you could literally get a PhD on these things, on light, and you can get very lost very quickly. So what is a good light for a carnivorous plant? You'll hear a lot of people talk about lumens and wattages and stuff like that. But what really matters when you're talking about carnivorous plants is PPFD. And to simply put it, it is the amount of light that is able to be absorbed by the plant. Now, depending on your carnivorous plants, it can run the spectrum, but for the most part, the very, 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 very lowest that you're going to want to give them is about 100 ppfd, and the very, very highest you're want to give them is about 800 to 900 ppfd. Now, depending on what you're growing, like a Nepenthes, like I said, they're going to do better more on the lower spectrum as opposed to a Drosera or a Venus flytrap that are going to want to go higher. Now, don't worry. This information is usually provided either on the box that the light comes in, or you can find it in the description if you're buying it on Amazon. If you don't see it there, you can ask the supplier for the PPFD, but there's also a calculation that you can do for wattage to turn that into PPFD to find out what you need. But for the most part, that's what you're going to want to look at. Now, there are some things that to take into consideration, like the spectrum of light. 6,000 Kelvin, 7,000 Kelvin, 4,000 Kelvin. All these things mean that they are meant to help the plant do specific things. Blue lights, red lights. For the most part, when you're buying these LEDs specifically for growing, you're going to have all that wrapped into one. You can get lost with the diode amounts and all that other stuff. But when you're just first starting out, the most important thing is PPFD. The next question that's sort of clustered into this group of questions for growing these plants from the beginning is what type of water and how to water. Now, that varies depending on what plant you're wanting to grow. When it comes to Nepenthes or pitcher plants, you're going to want to top water, but there's a few caveats to that. Now, there has been some confusion in some earlier videos when I said about misting the pitchers, and I'll get that in a minute. But you don't want to mist the plants of Nepenthes. You don't want to top water and mist them. You want to top water and get on their media. And the reason for that is it can cause a lot of mildew issues and potentially can lead to rot if you're misting them. They don't really like to have their leaves all that wet too much. Some are much better at handling that than others, like a truncata or a Rob Cantley do not want water on their leaves, and they will develop what's called oedema. But for the most part, you want to top water and you want to get it on the media surface. People, if you use an irrigation system, use the drip method. That works very well. Now, if you're talking about a Drosera, Venus flytrap, cephalotus, they like to be bottom watered. You do not want to top water these plants. And the reason for that is you can get crown rot if you are top watering them. Specifically, cephalotus is extremely susceptible to crown rot, and Venus flytrap can be as well. Drosera is a little bit more forgiving, but if you top water, you're going to potentially run the risk of washing off some of that mucilage that creates that dew. But for the most part, when it comes to the sundews, the bog plants, again, the Sarracenias, the cephalotus, anything like that, which aren't technically bog plants, but they can be handled the same way, you're going to want to bottom water them. And the way you can do that is through the tray method. You simply place the plant in a tray that can hold water, and then you want the water to be about 2 inches deep, depending on the size of your pot. Some like it better than others. A Venus flytrap will handle about an inch or inch and a half of water, as long as you give them a very, very brief dry out period, which we'll go into more detail in a later video. But the bog plants, Sarracenia, they like a higher water table, and Drosera can also handle a higher water table. You can, and I cannot specify this enough or put a caveat to this, some people do use the tray method for Nepenthes, but I do not recommend that for beginners. That requires an understanding of what levels of water in the media, what they want. I recommend that you don't tray water if you're new to Nepenthes. Now, what type of water can you use? Well, you can use reverse osmosis water, distilled water, or rainwater. The caveat to rainwater is make sure that that rainwater, if it's coming off of a roof and going into like a rain barrel, that you are testing the water to make sure that it does not have over 50 parts per million of any sort of minerals, because what will happen is over time that mineral will build up in the soil, and it can cause damage and even kill your plant. I recommend that you get yourself a meter and test the the minerals per million. Make sure that's under 50. That way you know it's safe. Now on that, there's a lot of back and forth or whether or not you can use refrigerant or not refrigerant, runoff from a AC unit, or if you can use the runoff from a dehumidifier. Now, I specifically almost always use the runoff from a dehumidifier, but there is a catch. One is you need to test it, make sure it's 50 parts per million or less. But the second thing is you want to make sure that you keep a relatively a good cleaning schedule with the dehumidifier, because it can grow mold and you don't want to introduce that into your plants. But I use it and it's worked very well. It's an unlimited source of water almost, as long as it's filling up in the home. And so I use that water because frankly it gets very expensive using distilled water. Now if you're wanting to grow something on a larger scale, then you're going to want to potentially look at reverse osmosis systems that can help. Just make sure that you have a cutoff valve or maybe even a backup cutoff valve, because I've heard stories of those bulbs failing and it causes a lot of catastrophic issues. Let's get into specifics. So questions are for pitcher plants is, why is my pitcher plant not pitchering? Now there could be a lot of reasons for this, but the main one is not enough light. These plants require a lot of energy to produce these pitchers, and so they're going to get a lot of energy from their light source. And so if they're not getting enough light, they're not going to pitcher. There are other things, but we'll get there in just a minute. But as far as light goes, remember the PPFD is the most important thing. And you want to sort of gauge your plants, right? Some of them like a higher light than others, like a stenophylla is going to want more light, so I have them closer to the light than others. Their light requirements are going to be different, but for the most part, just keep an eye on your plant. If you start noticing that the leaf is turning red, that means they're getting more light than they need. Not necessarily a problem, but if they start developing what's called sun blisters or start to get these round brown circles, you want to pull them back from the light. Now, what if your pitchers are starting to produce and then they stop? This is usually a case of either not enough light and that they're right on the cusp of what they need, or it is a question of humidity and moisture. And so this is where things get a little controversial, because if your pitchers are starting to form, you can miss the pitchers every now and then, or take water and just put it on the pitchers every now and then. You just got to be careful that you don't get water on the leaves. But for the most part, that's usually a very drastic measure that you have to take. Most of these plants, while they may not pitcher at first, if you give them adequate light, most of them, especially the hybrids and the intermediate growers, will acclimate down to the lower humidity levels and will begin producing pitchers. It just might take them some time. Now let's talk about Drosera and Venus flytraps, things of that nature. Now Drosera need a lot of light in order to produce that mucilage. And so if your Drosera does not have mucilage on it, that is a clear indication that it's not getting enough light. Also, most of the plants, unless it's like an AF plant, are going to turn red, and that is a good sign when it comes to sundews. That means that they are very happy. So if your sundew does not have any mucilage or any of that dew that gets its name, you need to give it more light. Now, humidity isn't necessarily that important when it comes to sundews, but it is more important when it comes to Nepenthes. I'll get that in just a minute, but before I digress, let's talk about Venus flytraps. What does it look like when they're not happy? The traps will grow lower to the ground. Some varieties will grow lower to the ground, but for the most part, if they are keeping a very tight rosette on the ground and their traps aren't necessarily turning red in the middle, that's a good indicator they're not getting enough light. If they become very spindly, that means that they're in a really bad situation where they're not getting enough light at all, and those leaves are just reaching and reaching and reaching for the light. I've seen that where the plant barely has any leaves on it, and the ones that there are very long. It's because they are desperately searching out for light. Now let's talk about humidity. Humidity is one of those key foundation blocks for growing carnivorous plants. However, it's not as important as the type of water you use or the light that you use. Now, when it comes to Nepenthes, there is this misnomer that you need this extremely high humidity. Now, certainly there are some plants like lowlands that really like a high amount of humidity, but let's face it, not everybody can provide 80 to 90% humidity for their plants in a normal setting, and that shouldn't keep you from growing these plants. A lot of the hybrids have been hybridized in an effort to create plants that can thrive in lower humidity conditions, and some of them has just been a byproduct of how they've been grown. But for the most part, you're going to want to have about 50 to 75% humidity. Now, I understand that's not capable in every single home. In a grow tent like that is very easily attainable. But there's good news. Plants like truncata, Miranda, ventricosa, there's tons out there that may not pitcher at first, but will eventually acclimate down to the humidity of your home and will produce pitchers even in a relatively low humidity setting. Now, what you can do to help that situation is you can use humidifiers. You can use the tray method when it comes to Nepenthes, but as a caveat, make sure that you have something like the egg crate that you see in Industrial Lights. You can get that at any big box store, or something to keep the plant out of the water. What will happen as the water evaporates, it will cause ambient humidity around the plant and give that plant that extra boost that it needs. Now, when it comes to sundews and Venus flytraps, they actually don't require that much humidity. A lot of growers grow them at 80-90% humidity, and I don't really understand that. They can do very well in 30%, 40% humidity. That's what mine are at, and they do like crazy. The dew production is more around the photosynthesis and the energy that the plant gets, and not about the humidity. Certainly, some of them will do better in higher humidity than others, but for the most part, it's not as important as it is for like a Nepenthes. The last two things that I'm going to touch on in this video, because this could be very, very long, like I said, this is going to be one in a series, is we're going to talk about bag acclimation, and then also we're going to talk about airflow. Bag acclimation is absolutely critical to ensuring long-term success of your plant. I get a lot of questions as, do I have to bag acclimate the plant, and how do you bag acclimate? And the answer is yes, for a couple reasons. One is that helps for that humidity conversation we have, adjusting from the supplier who's probably growing them in 80-90% humidity down to your conditions. And then two, it allows you to ensure that you're not getting any pests that you're introducing to your collection. Now, how you bag acclimate is very simple. You put the pot inside a Ziploc bag and you close it all the way. Now, over time, over a period of about a week or two, you want to slowly start to open that bag. There's a 25, 50, 75, 100 rule. 25% of the bag open the first couple days, 50%, 75%, and 100. And what that allows the plant to do is slowly acclimate down to your environment. The other key for this is it allows you time to observe the plant and see if any pests were brought with it. Thrip, aphids, anything like that, you do not want to get on a large scale in your collection, and the bag acclimation will help with that. All this talk about humidity, I would be remiss if I did not talk about airflow. Now, all carnivorous plants want airflow, but some want it more than others. Let's first talk about pitcher plants or Nepenthes. Airflow is critical for healthy Nepenthes plants, and so you want to make sure that you give them adequate amounts. We've already talked about airflow for roots, and using that sphagnum perlite mix will give you that. But let's talk about the pots themselves. It's a good idea to put holes in your pots, and this will allow excess water to drain out first, but it will also allow air to get in between those roots and help them stay nice and cool, not necessarily dry, but help keep them from water sitting on them. Now, when it comes to Nepenthes, what I use is a fan and just have that fan blowing across them. You don't have to have the fan blowing the plants away. Keep in mind, the higher the fan, the quicker the media will dry out, and so you'll need to keep an eye on that. But there's a couple things that you can do to help ensure proper airflow. One is cut back any of the dead leaves or any of the dead pitchers, and that will allow adequate amount of air to pass through these stems. And the other thing is you don't want them clustered too tightly together. Now, they do like to be close because that's how they kind of grow in nature, but especially the lowlanders. But you want to not have them sitting on top of each other where they're choking out any potential for airflow, because that will cause some mold issues and could lead to other things like root rot, stem rot, if the media is not drying out. Let's talk about the more bog plants, Sarracenia, Drosera, Venus flytraps. They like airflow as well, and even though they are in more of a boggy setting and they have that sort of just sitting in that sort of muggy environment, they still want good airflow, and so I recommend people using a fan. Now, you don't have to blow them away. Again, they don't need airflow as much as the Nepenthes, but they like that. Airflow is always good, and there's a misnomer that high airflow means low humidity, and that's not the case. The airflow is important because if you do have a higher humidity, it allows the plants to thrive without introducing any sort of mold or fungus or mildew issues. Now, I know that this doesn't even come close to scratching the surface for all the questions, but I will get through the series and we will touch on all those questions. If you do have additional questions, please don't hesitate to comment below and ask me anything that you need to ask. We'll be covering a lot of different topics about how to feed your plants, what to feed your plants, and all kinds of other questions that we get. Keep in mind, it's important that you watch this video all the way through. Hopefully you're watching this end here. If not, then just ask me whatever your questions you have, but I hope that you've made it a point to watch this whole thing through. I appreciate you always, and I hope that you have a wonderful day and a wonderful week. I'll see you soon. Bye-bye.